In the closing years of the 19th century, New York was a city built on fortunes, steel, railroads, shipping, and speculation. Among the names whispered in parlors and printed in the papers, one carried a weight heavier than the rest: the Lancasters. To the public, they were a dynasty of industry, owners of mansions, patrons of the arts, and pillars of high society. But behind the marble walls of their Fifth Avenue estate, another story unfolded. It was not a tale of progress, nor of enterprise, but of oaths, rituals, and shadows older than the city itself. Wealth was not simply inherited, it was guarded, worshipped, and, some claimed, cursed. Servants spoke of secret chambers. Business partners hinted at strange conditions tied to Lancaster gold. And as the century turned, whispers grew into fear. This is the story of the Lancaster fortune and the cult that protected it, bound by blood, silence, and the ashes of those who crossed them. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. In the closing days of the 19th century, Fifth Avenue was the crown jewel of New York City. Carriages rattled past rows of brownstone homes, each striving to outshine the next with taller facades, grander windows, and gilded gates. Yet no house commanded more awe or suspicion than the Lancaster mansion. Built from fortunes carved out of steel and railroads, it rose like a fortress of white marble against the soot-stained skyline. To the casual passer-by, it was a monument to progress, a shimmering beacon of the industrial age. But for those who lived in its shadow, the house was something else entirely, a place where whispers clung to the stone walls like ivy. The mansion's doors stood taller than any churches, carved oak bound with wrought iron patterns that seemed less decorative and more like warnings. Servants who worked there often left after only a few months, muttering of sleepless nights, strange sounds echoing through the halls, and prayers spoken in languages they did not recognize. At night, when the gas lamps flickered outside, the upper windows glowed with candlelight long after the city had gone to sleep. Some said it was simply the indulgence of the Lancaster heirs, reveling in their endless wealth. Others claimed it was proof of something darker, that the family did not honor God at all, but something far older. Silas Lancaster, the family patriarch, had been the architect of this empire. Born with little, he clawed his way into the highest echelons of New York society, building railroads that stretched across states and factories that never slept. His face appeared in newspapers as often as the president's, always depicted as a symbol of American triumph. But in private, rumors swirled. Fellow industrialists whispered of his obsession with secret societies, of clandestine meetings held in the dead of night, and of deals struck not only with men, but with forces no honest Christian would name aloud. By 1899, the Lancaster fortune had swollen beyond imagination. It was said their combined wealth could rival entire nations. Yet with such fortune came unease. The neighborhood around the mansion watched with a mix of admiration and fear. Guests came and went through those iron gates, cloaked in silence, leaving with eyes that seemed unsettled, as though they had glimpsed something they were not meant to see. Children on the avenue avoided playing too close to the Lancaster walls, claiming they could hear whispers rising from the basement vents. Ministers spoke carefully when Lancaster money found its way into their churches, never asking too many questions. The mansion was not just a home, it was a stage, and behind its marble curtains, something ancient was said to stir. And so, as the century turned and New York prepared to march boldly into the modern era, the Lancaster mansion stood as a reminder that progress and darkness often walked hand in hand. Its marble facade gleamed in the sunlight, but to those who knew the stories, it was less a palace and more a temple guarding secrets not of wealth, but of worship. The death of Silas Lancaster struck New York like a thunderclap. One day, the titan of steel and railroads was seen descending the steps of his mansion, cane in hand, commanding every eye that dared meet his. The next, he was gone, dead in his sleep, the doctors said, though whispers claimed his passing had been anything but natural. His body was interred quickly, almost too quickly, in a family crypt on the estate grounds, sealed behind black marble doors. For a man whose name had come to define industry itself, The suddenness of it all left the city unsettled. But what followed was stranger still. When the family gathered to hear the reading of his will, it was not in the polished offices of a lawyer, as tradition would dictate. Instead, they assembled in the mansion's candlelit chapel, its stained glass windows casting fractured shadows across the pews. The attorney, a pale man named Abernathy, unrolled the heavy parchment with trembling hands, as though the words he was about to speak had weight beyond gold. The fortune, as expected, was staggering. Railroads, factories, shipping lines, and investments across the globe. Yet every clause seemed bound not only by law, but by ritual. To claim their inheritance, each Lancaster heir was instructed to perform tasks not written in legal jargon, but in cryptic, almost arcane language. Certain properties would remain sealed until prayers were spoken over them in the family chapel. Stocks and bonds could not be touched unless a night-long vigil was held on the anniversary of Silas's death. Even the grand Fifth Avenue mansion itself was to remain under the family's control only if the heirs gathered each month for a ritual of remembrance, a phrase Abernathy spoke with unease, his voice faltering as he glanced at Eleanor Lancaster, the widow, who watched him with cold, unwavering eyes. The heirs Jonathan, Margaret, and Samuel shifted uneasily in their seats. Jonathan, ever the ambitious eldest, smirked as though the strange requirements were a game he was eager to master. Margaret looked pale, her gloved hands twisting nervously in her lap. Samuel, the youngest, sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the floor as though the words themselves carried a weight he could feel pressing against his chest. It became clear that Silas had left behind more than wealth. He had left a set of instructions, bindings that tethered the family fortune not only to banks and ledgers, but to something unseen, something Eleanor seemed to understand all too well. The will was not just a legal document. It was a covenant, one that bound the heirs not merely to their inheritance, but to the very forces Silas had courted in life. And as the candles flickered in the suffocating stillness of that chapel, the heirs realized their father's hand would guide them even from the grave, demanding not obedience to law, but devotion to something far older and far more dangerous. With Silas Lancaster buried and his will already reshaping the destiny of his heirs, it was Eleanor Lancaster who stepped forward to seize control of the family's affairs. To the outside world she appeared as the grieving widow, a woman draped in mourning black who rarely left the mansion gates. Yet behind closed doors, she was far from broken. Eleanor had always been more than a socialite. Those who knew her well, though few dared to admit it, spoke of her fascination with seances, her private consultations with mediums, and her habit of corresponding with secretive men from Europe, whose names were never spoken aloud. It began quietly, with visitors arriving under the cover of night. At first they were spiritualists from the city, men and women who claimed to speak to the dead or read the signs of the stars. They entered the Lancaster mansion through the servants' entrance, cloaked in secrecy, carrying trunks of curious instruments. Crystal orbs, brass pendulums, strange powders sealed in glass vials. But soon the circle widened. Scholars from abroad appeared, pale men with hollow eyes who muttered in languages none of the household staff could recognize. A French mystic with scarred hands stayed for weeks at a time. A former Jesuit, cast out of the church for heresy, dined at Eleanor's table as though he were family. The servants whispered of a name that began to circulate among them, the Circle of Ash. No one knew where it had originated, but soon it seemed to be on every tongue. They claimed the group met deep within the Lancaster chapel, long after the rest of the house had fallen silent. Strange smells would rise through the vents. Burnt herbs, acrid smoke, sometimes the unmistakable scent of iron and blood. The sounds were worse, low chanting, a chorus of voices rising and falling in rhythms that no hymn had ever followed. Eleanor herself seemed transformed. Once known for her sharp tongue and commanding presence at society gatherings, she now carried an air of quiet authority, as though she were not just a widow but a high priestess presiding over some hidden kingdom. She spoke little to her children during these days, leaving Jonathan, Margaret, and Samuel to wonder whether they had inherited their father's fortune at all, or whether their mother now wielded it in ways they could not comprehend. It was said that on certain nights, when the circle gathered, Eleanor would emerge hours later, her face pale but her eyes gleaming with a strange, feverish light. She moved through the house like someone who had glimpsed another world and returned only half in spirit. Those who served her swore she no longer belonged fully to the realm of the living. By the end of that winter, the Lancaster mansion no longer belonged simply to its heirs. It had become the headquarters of something else entirely, a society bound not by blood but by devotion to Eleanor and the shadowed forces she commanded. And though none dared speak it aloud, the servants knew the truth. The Lancaster fortune was no longer just guarded by walls of marble, but by the circle of ash, whose reach and purpose were still only beginning to unfold. The death of Silas Lancaster left his children cloaked not only in wealth but in the weight of a legacy they did not fully understand. Jonathan, Margaret, and Samuel were suddenly among the richest young heirs in America, their names etched into newspapers alongside fortunes measured not in thousands, but in millions. Yet for all the glittering promise of their inheritance, the true nature of their father's empire and their mother's quiet dominion cast long shadows across their lives. Jonathan Lancaster, the eldest, was already known to the city's elite. At 28, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he had been chosen for greatness. Handsome in a severe way, with dark hair slicked back and sharp eyes that never softened, Jonathan embraced his role as the new head of the family's businesses. But beyond the polished exterior, he hungered for power far greater than wealth could buy. Eleanor saw in him a natural leader, and it was Jonathan who was given the role of heir not just to the fortune, but to the rituals themselves. He was placed at the center of the circle of ash, his hand guided through chants and symbols as though he were being trained for something more than business. Margaret, at 24, was her father's mirror in intelligence and her mother's in poise. She had long been admired in New York society for her beauty, but behind her calm demeanor lived a restless spirit. Unlike Jonathan, Margaret had no hunger for dominance, but she carried within her a sensitivity that Eleanor harnessed. It was Margaret who was asked to sit during séances, who was urged to hold the relics the circle had gathered, and who often fell into strange trances that left her trembling and pale. Servants whispered that Margaret could see things the others could not, that she alone heard the voices Eleanor claimed to summon. Whether she truly believed or was merely swept along by her mother's influence, no one could say. But her role within the circle became one of conduit and vessel. Samuel, the youngest at just 20, stood apart from his siblings. He was quieter, softer, his disposition unsuited for the ruthless world of industry and the darker world his family inhabited. He had inherited his father's nervous hands and his mother's penetrating eyes, but there was doubt written into every line of his face. Samuel attended the gatherings, watched the rituals, and whispered his oaths when commanded, yet his heart was never fully in it. In private, he filled notebooks with questions, prayers, and confessions, as though he were trying to reason his way out of the labyrinth his family had built. Though bound together by blood, the three Lancaster heirs stood at very different crossroads. Jonathan's ambition, Margaret's strange gift, and Samuel's unease set the stage for divisions that wealth could not mend. And while the city looked upon them as young titans destined to shape the new century, inside the mansion's walls they were being shaped into something else entirely, heirs not only of fortune, but of a cult whose power demanded more than obedience. It demanded sacrifice. The Lancaster Chapel was unlike any other structure on Fifth Avenue. While the mansion glittered with marble and gold, the chapel was older, heavier, its stones black with age, and imported from a ruined monastery in Europe. Its presence unsettled even the servants, who avoided passing near its iron doors after dark. Some swore the stones themselves seemed to breathe, that they carried with them a chill foreign to the rest of the house. This was where Eleanor chose to gather her children before the division of Silas Lancaster's fortune, and it was here that the true shape of their inheritance revealed itself. On a bitter winter night, Jonathan, Margaret, and Samuel were summoned into the chapel. The hall was lit not by lamps or chandeliers, but by hundreds of candles whose flames cast restless shadows across the walls. The stained glass windows, far from the biblical scenes one might expect, depicted strange winged figures with too many eyes, their faces obscured by spirals and fire. In the center of the chamber, before a black marble altar, Eleanor stood waiting, dressed in mourning black, her veil drawn back so that her pale face gleamed in the candlelight. She spoke softly, yet every word echoed as though the chapel amplified her voice. The inheritance, she said, was more than wealth. It was a covenant. To unlock the fortune Silas had left behind, each heir was required to swear an oath of silence, binding them not only to secrecy but to loyalty to the Circle of Ash. Without this vow, the will itself would not recognize their claims. Silas had written it so, and Eleanor, with her circle of mystics, would enforce it. Jonathan stepped forward first, his face lit with confidence. He placed his hand upon the altar, repeating the words Eleanor instructed, his voice steady and proud. To him, the oath was not a burden but a key, a passage into the authority he had long desired. Margaret followed, her hand trembling as she spoke. Her voice faltered, yet when she finished, Eleanor's eyes shone with satisfaction, as though she had secured something more valuable than gold from her daughter's wavering lips. Samuel was the last. His steps were reluctant, his gaze fixed on the altar as though it concealed a living thing beneath its cold surface. When he repeated the words, his voice cracked, his chest tightening as though each phrase pulled him further into a trap he could not escape. Yet he finished, and the chapel seemed to grow darker, the candles fluttering as if in approval. When it was done, Eleanor raised her hands, declaring that the heirs were now bound not only by law but by blood, silence, and devotion. From that night forward, none of them could speak of what they had seen or done without forfeiting everything. The fortune, the mansion, and the legacy of Silas Lancaster were theirs, but only as long as they honored the oath and the shadows that listened from within the chapel walls. The snow fell heavy over Fifth Avenue the night Margaret Lancaster's maid vanished. Her name was Clara, a quiet young woman from Brooklyn who had entered service only months before, grateful for the wages and the prestige of working in the city's grandest home. She was devoted to Margaret, tending to her wardrobe, brushing out her long auburn hair, and accompanying her on errands into the city. Yet despite her loyalty, Clara seemed unsettled by the atmosphere of the Lancaster mansion. Servants had noticed how she crossed herself when passing the chapel, how she shivered when the basement door was left open, how she whispered that strange voices sometimes rose from beneath the floors in the dead of night. On that winter evening, Clara was last seen carrying linens down the servants' corridor, her figure vanishing into the dimness. Hours later, she had not returned. By morning, her bed in the attic quarters lay untouched, her meager belongings neatly folded, as if she had intended to return. But she never did. Panic spread quietly among the staff, though none dared speak openly of their fears. The Lancaster family was notified, and Eleanor herself dismissed the matter coldly, insisting Clara had likely fled back to her relatives in Brooklyn. Yet Margaret wept when she heard the news, insisting Clara would never abandon her without a word. Word of the disappearance reached the police soon after, but their inquiries were brief and perfunctory. Detectives arrived at the mansion, asked a handful of questions, and departed with unusual haste. Money, it was said, had changed hands. The case never made the papers, and within days, Clara's name vanished from official records as if she had never existed. But the servants knew better, and their whispers grew bolder when the masters were not listening. They spoke of noises that had echoed from the basement. That same night, the scrape of chairs across stone, muffled chanting, and the sudden cry of a woman silenced too quickly. Some swore they had seen a procession of candlelight flickering through the cracks beneath the basement door. Others claimed that when they passed through the corridor the next morning, the air smelled of smoke and iron, like blood burned into the stone. Margaret grew pale and withdrawn in the days that followed, her once lively eyes dulled by grief and something close to fear. She stopped speaking of Clara, though her silence carried more weight than words. Jonathan dismissed it all as servant gossip, but Samuel wrote in his diary that something unholy had taken place beneath their home, and that Clara's disappearance was not a flight but a sacrifice. The city carried on, blind to the absence of one more maid. But within the mansion, the whispers became impossible to ignore. Clara had been taken by the circle of ash, her fate sealed in the shadows of the Lancaster basement, a price paid for wealth that demanded more than coin. Charles Hensley had served the Lancaster family for nearly a decade. A meticulous man with spectacles perched perpetually at the end of his nose, he took pride in balancing the labyrinthine ledgers of one of New York's wealthiest dynasties. Yet, in the months following Silas Lancaster's death, Hensley began to notice peculiarities in the accounts. At first, the irregularities seemed harmless enough: withdrawals made in large sums, paid in cash rather than checks, routed through obscure intermediaries. But as he traced the movements of money with his sharpened pencil, the pattern became too strange to ignore. These expenditures were not tied to new factories or shipping ventures. They were not even the reckless indulgences of a privileged family accustomed to extravagance. Instead, the money was flowing toward objects and curiosities that defied explanation. Invoices arrived for crates of ancient manuscripts written in forgotten tongues, purchased from dealers in Europe. Receipts recorded payments for shipments of bones, some marked archaeological specimens, others disturbingly vague. And among the strangest of them all were commissions for statues and idols, carved from a black marble so rare it was said to be quarried only in the most desolate corners of the world. Hensley's unease grew as he reviewed these documents by lamplight in his office. The sums involved were staggering, yet Eleanor Lancaster approved every transaction without hesitation. When he cautiously inquired about the nature of these acquisitions, she silenced him with a stare that brooked no further questions. Her voice, calm but edged with steel, reminded him that his loyalty to the family was not only expected but absolute. Still, doubt festered in him, for these were not the expenditures of a family protecting its wealth. They were the purchases of zealots, feeding some hidden hunger. The more Hensley uncovered, the more he felt as though he were peering into a secret world beneath the balance sheets. The idols, described in shipping logs as winged, faceless figures with spiraled forms, unsettled him. The manuscripts, written on brittle vellum, were said to be centuries old, their words undecipherable by any scholar the dealers dared consult, and the bones, he could not stop thinking of the bones. One ledger recorded a shipment labeled "Human Remains, Origin Undisclosed." At night, Hensley dreamed of those entries, of candlelit halls where such objects might be displayed, of rituals conducted in whispers around them. He began to suspect what the servants had long whispered, that the Lancaster fortune was not merely being spent but sacrificed, converted into offerings for a cult whose appetites reached beyond reason. He told himself he was imagining things, that he was merely an accountant, not a detective. Yet each page he turned made him feel less like a man of numbers and more like a witness, one who had stumbled onto truths he was never meant to see. And though he tried to bury his doubts beneath neat columns of ink, the certainty grew in his mind. The Lancasters were guarding something far more dangerous than money. The circle of ash, once a secret confined within the walls of the Lancaster mansion, began to spread its reach beyond the family. At first, the gatherings were small, attended only by Eleanor and her children, along with a handful of mystics she trusted. But as the months wore on, the flicker of candlelight in the chapel grew brighter, and the circle of figures kneeling before the black marble altar multiplied. The Lancasters were not content to keep their rights hidden from the powerful; they sought to bind the powerful to them. Invitations were extended with the utmost care, veiled as exclusive dinners or intimate discussions on philosophy and finance. Those who attended found themselves ushered into a world that blurred the line between opulence and nightmare. Industrialists who had built empires from coal and steel, judges who presided over the city's courts, and politicians whose votes could shape entire states, all were quietly drawn into the Lancaster orbit. The initiations were said to begin with feasts, tables laden with wines imported from Europe and meats seasoned with rare spices. Conversation flowed, laughter echoed, and trust was cultivated. Yet as the night deepened, the guests were led from the glittering halls down into the chapel below. There, the warmth of luxury gave way to the cold silence of stone. Each guest was confronted not with words of persuasion, but with ritual, a choice laid before them that was at once intoxicating and terrifying. What was asked of them was simple in form, but grave in meaning. Each initiate was required to make an offering part wealth, part blood. Wealth was easy. Fortunes changed hands with a stroke of a pen, banknotes folded neatly into the coffers of the circle. But blood demanded more. Some pricked their fingers, letting drops fall onto the altar as they repeated words Eleanor whispered into their ears. Others, bolder or more desperate for power, brought their own offerings. Animals slain, relics steeped in death, even whispers of human lives cut short in alleyways far from Fifth Avenue. Once initiated, there was no turning back. The secrets witnessed in that chamber bound them tighter than any contract could. And for their silence and loyalty, the circle promised rewards, protection from ruin, influence over rivals, and the invisible hand of Lancaster wealth, guiding them through the perils of public life. The mansion became more than a home. It was a nexus, a gathering place where power and darkness mingled freely. By the time spring arrived, the Circle of Ash had outgrown its whispered beginnings. It had become a network stretching through the veins of New York itself, its members wearing the faces of respectability by day while kneeling in shadows by night. And for each new oath sworn in candlelight, the Lancaster fortune grew not weaker but stronger, fed by loyalty purchased with both money and blood. As the Circle of Ash grew in number and influence, the Lancaster Chapel transformed from a private family sanctuary into the very heart of the cult. Once meant to be a place of mourning and remembrance, it now served as a temple where wealth and power were funneled into ritual. From the outside, it appeared unchanged, a stone outbuilding resting quietly beside the mansion. But within its blackened walls, the atmosphere thickened with incense, candle smoke, and whispers that never seemed to fade even after the ceremonies had ended. The stained glass windows were unlike any in the city. No saints or angels adorned the panes, but rather beings with too many eyes, wings bent at impossible angles, and faces that blurred into spirals of light and shadow. When sunlight struck them during the day, their distorted shapes spilled across the chapel floor, twisting into strange patterns that unnerved even the most devout members of the circle. By night, when the chamber glowed with candles, those same figures seemed alive, as if they bent and shifted to watch the proceedings below. The altar, a slab of polished black marble streaked with veins of crimson, became the centerpiece of every gathering. It was here that oaths were spoken, blood was spilled, and offerings of both coin and life were laid before forces none dared to name aloud. Eleanor presided with a presence that grew more commanding with each passing month. She had shed the image of grieving widow entirely and stood now as high priestess of a faith that had no scripture, only whispers carried down through the rituals she guarded. The chapel became a place of constant activity. By day, shipments arrived under the guise of furniture or art, unloaded by discreet hands and taken into the basement beneath the chapel. By night, processions of robed figures moved through the mansion's corridors, their faces masked, their footsteps soundless on the marble floors. The servants who remained kept their eyes down, for those who looked too long or asked too many questions rarely stayed in service for long. Jonathan took his place at the altar beside his mother, eager to demonstrate his strength. Margaret was often seated just behind them, her eyes closed, murmuring words as though she were a vessel channeling voices no one else could hear. Samuel, though present, appeared increasingly hollow, his gaze fixed not on the altar but on the windows, as though searching for escape through the warped glass. By the turn of the year, the Lancaster Chapel was no longer whispered of as a curiosity. It was feared as a place where the city's elite entered under the cloak of night and emerged with eyes that gleamed too brightly, as if they had glimpsed something beyond the veil of human understanding. The House of Ash, as the servants now called it, had become a sanctuary, not of faith, but of power, and its shadow stretched far beyond Fifth Avenue. Jonathan Lancaster had always been marked by a restless energy. Even as a child, he was the one who challenged his tutors, who refused to follow rules unless they bent to his advantage. Now, as a grown man standing in the glow of the family's immense fortune, that same hunger burned brighter. Wealth was not enough for him. Influence, connections, and even the quiet awe the city held for the Lancaster name, all of it left him unsatisfied. What he desired was control, not only over the family's empire but over the circle of ash itself. At first, his ambition showed itself in subtle ways. He stood closer to the altar during ceremonies, his hands lingering on the black marble longer than necessary. He spoke with a confidence that sometimes overpowered Eleanor's instructions, suggesting improvements to the rituals and offering interpretations of the cryptic words found in the manuscripts their money had purchased. The other members, industrialists and judges alike, began to look at him with something between admiration and unease. But subtlety soon gave way to recklessness. Jonathan began leading his own gatherings when Eleanor was absent, small midnight assemblies in the bowels of the mansion. Here, he abandoned restraint. Where Eleanor sought order and secrecy, Jonathan sought spectacle. He demanded greater offerings, insisting that the circle's power was wasted on half measures. Blood, he claimed, was the true currency of the ancient forces they served, and without it, their wealth and power were nothing but dust. The rituals he devised bore little resemblance to the controlled rites his mother had introduced. He called for symbols carved into flesh, for incantations shouted rather than whispered, for offerings that left the floor of the chapel slick and dark. Some were enthralled by his daring, drawn to the raw intensity of his vision. Others recoiled, muttering that he was pushing the circle toward exposure, that his recklessness would draw unwanted eyes. Eleanor watched her son with a mixture of pride and dread. She had always known Jonathan possessed a fire the others lacked, but now she began to wonder if that fire would consume them all. She warned him in private, her voice low and urgent. But Jonathan only smiled. The kind of smile that revealed he no longer saw himself as her heir, but as her equal, perhaps even her replacement. Servants whispered that strange sounds echoed through the mansion more frequently, now screams muffled by thick stone walls, chanting that rattled the chandeliers. Rumors spread among the initiated that Jonathan had gone beyond animals, that his offerings had begun to demand human lives. Whether true or not, those whispers fed his reputation, making him at once feared and admired. For Jonathan Lancaster, wealth was merely a foundation. Power was the prize he sought, and if he had to tear apart the very order his mother built to claim it, then so be it. The circle of ash, once Eleanor's creation, was slowly slipping into his grasp, reshaped by his boldness, his ruthlessness, and his insatiable hunger. The first chill of autumn clung to the docks when the body surfaced in the East River. It was a dockworker, a man known only by the name Patrick among his fellows, who had been hauling crates for the Lancaster shipping warehouses. The tide brought him to shore one gray morning, his limbs twisted unnaturally, his chest carved with symbols that no common knife could have drawn by accident. The police who came to the scene whispered to one another in hushed tones, for the mutilations were not the marks of drunken violence or robbery. They were deliberate, arranged, ritualistic. The newspapers caught wind of the death before noon. Headlines cried out about a dockside horror, and rumors spread through taverns and boarding houses that the man had been sacrificed. But the details that never reached print were the ones that chilled the detectives most. The spirals carved into Patrick's skin matched the very designs seen in the stained glass of the Lancaster chapel. His body had been arranged with his arms outstretched, his eyes wide open as though forced to watch something in his final moments. 2 detectives were assigned to investigate, men hardened by years of navigating the corruption of New York's underbelly. They traced Patrick's last steps to the Lancaster warehouses, where he had been seen working late into the night before he disappeared. The warehouse managers answered questions politely but too quickly, their ledgers conspicuously absent of the shift Patrick had supposedly worked. When the detectives pressed further, doors began to close around them. Witnesses who had spoken openly at first suddenly fell silent. A union man who claimed to have seen a black carriage near the docks that night recanted his story after a single visit from Lancaster lawyers. Undeterred, the detectives dug deeper. They sought connections between the Lancasters' growing influence and the deaths that seemed to gather in the city's shadows. But just as their search began to take shape, they too vanished. Their desks at the precinct were left untouched, their cases unfinished, their absence explained away as a sudden transfer to another jurisdiction. Those who had known them best shook their heads in disbelief. Men like that did not simply disappear. Down at the docks, the workers carried on, but unease spread among them. They spoke of shadows moving in the warehouses long after midnight, of strange chanting carried faintly across the water. Patrick's death became a warning, a silent threat carved into flesh. Those who stumbled too close to the Lancaster secrets would not live to tell of it. And though the newspapers moved on, burying the story beneath headlines of politics and war abroad, the East River carried its own memory. The tide had returned a body once, and the tide, indifferent and eternal, could do so again. Samuel Lancaster had always been the quietest of Silas's children, the one most easily overlooked at the grand dinners, the one whose words were often drowned out by Jonathan's boldness or Margaret's eerie composure. But in his silence, Samuel carried a mind that saw what others refused to acknowledge. Where his siblings reveled in the rituals, Samuel trembled. Where they saw power, he saw shadows stretching long across their fortune. It was in his diaries that his unease found a voice. By candlelight in the privacy of his chamber, he scrawled feverishly into leather-bound volumes, his handwriting growing shakier with each passing week. He wrote of the sounds that crept through the mansion's halls at night, the rhythmic pounding from beneath the chapel, the guttural chants muffled by stone. He confessed to dreams that plagued him, visions of eyes staring from the stained glass, of rivers of black water running through the family vaults, of his father Silas standing at the altar with lips sewn shut. More than anything, Samuel wrote of guilt. He remembered the day Margaret's maid vanished, the whispers of her cries faintly echoing through the floorboards. He remembered the dockworker's mutilated body found in the East River, and how Jonathan had smiled the following night, his hands still smelling of iron. Samuel could not rid himself of the belief that these deaths were tethered directly to the fortune they hoarded, that every gold coin in the Lancaster coffers was stained with invisible blood. "The money is cursed," he wrote one night, his ink smudged by trembling hands. "It is not merely earned from steel and railroads, it has been bartered for, traded piece by piece to something older than commerce. We are not heirs to fortune but prisoners to it. The wealth does not serve us. We serve it." His paranoia deepened with each ceremony. He described how Eleanor's eyes no longer seemed human to him, how Jonathan's voice carried a resonance that made his bones ache, how Margaret's smile lingered too long as though she were listening to whispers only she could hear. Samuel began to avoid the chapel altogether, feigning illness or retreating into the city to escape the suffocating air of Fifth Avenue. But absence did little to quiet his torment. He felt followed, watched from alleys and reflections in shop windows. Servants avoided his gaze, as if they too sensed he was drifting from the path laid out by Eleanor. The more Samuel wrote, the clearer his conviction became. Their empire, gilded and admired by the world, was nothing more than a gilded cage. The Lancaster name was not a blessing but a curse, one bought with rituals carved into flesh and oaths whispered in darkness. And though he longed to escape, Samuel confessed in his final entry of the month that the curse was inescapable. "There is no leaving," he scrawled. "The wealth binds us tighter than blood." The Lancaster mansion glittered with light on the night of the banquet, its chandeliers blazing so brightly they could be seen from the street. Invitations had been whispered rather than written, hand-delivered to those whose power was too great to risk scandal. Senators, newspaper magnates, shipping tycoons, and judges whose pens could silence or free any man in New York. To the world, it was a lavish dinner, another indulgence of the city's most untouchable family. To those within the circle, it was something far more binding. The grand dining hall was transformed into a theater of decadence. The table stretched nearly the length of the room, draped in silk and set with golden plates. Servants moved in silence, placing before the guests platters of roasted pheasant, glazed hams, and fruits imported from across the ocean. But it was the wine that commanded the evening. Deep red and poured endlessly, it shimmered with something more than grapes. The chalices passed into each guest's hands carried a secret infusion, a hallucinogenic mixture prepared by Eleanor's mystics. The guests laughed as they drank, their cheeks flushing, their voices rising in drunken merriment. Yet beneath the laughter, something shifted. Their eyes glazed, their movements slowed, and the brilliance of the chandeliers seemed to warp, casting shadows that bent in strange directions. By the time dessert was served, most could no longer distinguish between reality and vision. It was then that Eleanor rose, her mask of black lace shimmering in the candlelight. Around her, every Lancaster child wore their own disguise. Jonathan in a gilded mask shaped like a lion's head, Margaret in a pale mask carved with tear-streaked cheeks, Samuel in one so plain it seemed almost unfinished. The room fell silent as Eleanor lifted her glass. She spoke not of wealth or family legacy, but of allegiance, of the ancient covenant that bound them all together. Her words, soft at first, deepened into a cadence that vibrated through the bones of every guest. She promised protection, prosperity, and unseen power, but only to those who swore themselves not to her family alone, but to the circle of ash. One by one, the guests were guided to rise from their seats and approach the altar erected at the far end of the hall. Draped in black silk, it bore the same spiral symbols carved into the chapel's marble. There, under the influence of the drugged wine, each guest pricked their finger and let a drop of blood fall onto the altar's surface. Their words were muddled, but the oaths they spoke were binding nonetheless. Carried on the rhythm, Eleanor whispered into their ears. By the end of the night, the banquet hall reeked of incense and wine. The guests slumped back in their chairs with masks askew and hands stained faintly red. They would wake the next morning with hazy memories, uncertain whether what they had seen was dream or truth. But the circle would remember. And in the ledger of the Lancasters, another dozen names had been added: judges, tycoons, senators, all of them now tethered by blood and by oath to the House of Ash. Beneath the Lancaster mansion, beyond the wine cellars and coal stores, lay a door that servants avoided even when their duties took them close. It was an iron vault, tall and arched, its surface blackened with age, though its locks gleamed with a polish that suggested constant use. Few had ever seen it opened, and those who had never spoke of what lay within. To the staff, it was simply the sealed vault, a place best ignored, for the whispers around it were heavy enough to weigh on the soul. The door had no key in the ordinary sense. Instead, it bore a locking mechanism wrought with intricate designs, spirals interlaced with winged shapes, patterns that made the eyes ache if stared at too long. Rumor claimed it could be opened only during certain rites, when blood and wordless chants aligned to release the tumblers within. Each time the vault groaned open, the sound echoed through the mansion like the tolling of a distant bell, and servants would cross themselves, praying silently that their masters would not call for them that night. Within were said to be relics of a different world. Not treasures bought from the markets of Europe, but objects carried in secrecy, bartered not with coin but with lives. A mask of bone so thin it seemed translucent, etched with sigils that no scholar could read. A shard of stone darker than obsidian, said to have been unearthed from beneath an abandoned monastery in the Carpathians. A chalice carved from ivory that pulsed faintly when held to the light, as if blood still coursed through it. And idols, always idols, faceless figures with too many arms, their shapes twisting so unnaturally that one could not look at them without feeling watched. The servants spoke in hushed voices of one boy, a coal hauler, who had glimpsed inside when Jonathan had left the vault ajar. His hair turned white within a week, and by the end of the month he was gone. His body shipped quietly back to his family in Pennsylvania. Another servant, a maid, claimed to have heard voices from behind the iron door, voices that shifted from whispers to screams and back again. She vanished soon after. For Eleanor, the vault was sacred, the very heart of the circle's power. Jonathan saw it as a treasury waiting to be unlocked, a storehouse of weapons he alone was bold enough to wield. Samuel, when he passed near it, felt only dread, as though the iron itself breathed. The vault did not merely contain relics, it contained the weight of bargains struck generations before, prices paid in blood so that the Lancaster fortune might rise. To those who dared imagine what might happen should the vault ever be flung fully open, the answer came swiftly and unbidden. It would not only change the family, but perhaps the city itself. By the spring of 1900s, the whispers about the Lancaster family had begun to spread beyond the alleys and taverns of New York. City Hall itself could not ignore them. Reports of missing workers tied to Lancaster warehouses, bribes delivered to judges, and the strange midnight gatherings at Fifth Avenue reached the ears of men who prided themselves on keeping order, even if that order often came at a price. A plan was quietly drawn. The mansion would be searched, its cellars examined, its secrets dragged into daylight. The lead detective on the case was a man named Edward Mallory, a veteran of the force with a reputation for incorruptibility. Unlike many of his peers, he was not swayed by Lancaster wealth. He had seen too many cases vanish under the weight of money and influence, and he swore this one would not. For weeks he built his evidence, collecting statements from workers, gathering ledgers that hinted at irregularities, even speaking to a servant who had fled the mansion and refused to return. By early June, Mallory had assembled a team of trusted men, all of them prepared to storm the Lancaster estate. The raid was scheduled for a Friday night. Wagons were prepared, warrants written, and weapons loaded. Yet on the very morning the men were to gather, the order was rescinded. A letter arrived from City Hall, stamped with the mayor's seal, declaring the investigation unfounded and instructing Mallory to stand down. The wording was curt, but its meaning was plain. The Lancasters had reached further into city government than even Mallory had feared. That evening, his men dispersed reluctantly, muttering about how power and wealth rotted every good intention in the city. Mallory, furious and defiant, returned to his home with his papers tucked beneath his arm. He told his wife that he would not give up, that someone had to stand against the family no matter the cost. The next morning, his wife found him drowned in his own bathtub. The scene bore the crude markings of an accident, water splashed across the tile, his clothes discarded carelessly nearby. But those who knew Mallory doubted the explanation. The man had been sober, steady, and too careful by nature to slip so tragically. The coroner's report declared it a mishap. Yet beneath the official record, the whispers told another story. Mallory had been silenced. Within days, the evidence he had gathered vanished from the precinct. The servant who had spoken with him was never seen again, and the men who had prepared for the raid learned to keep their silence, for their families, too, depended on it. The Lancaster mansion remained untouched, its doors never forced open, its vault never breached. And in the city's memory, the raid became nothing more than a rumor and action planned but never carried out, swallowed whole by the power of a family whose shadow stretched across every office of New York. The night Eleanor Lancaster died, the mansion was swollen with storm. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled above Manhattan like the growl of some vast beast circling its prey. Inside the chapel, candles sputtered as gusts slipped through unseen cracks, their light falling in restless shadows across the stained glass windows, where too many eyes and wings seemed to watch the gathering below. Eleanor stood at the altar, robed in black silk embroidered with spirals of crimson thread. Her presence had always filled the chamber, commanding obedience from every member of the circle of ash. But that night, her movements seemed slower, her breath heavier, as though the years of leading rituals had taken their toll. Still, she raised her hands, the room falling into silence as her voice threaded through the air. She recited words older than the family name, syllables that shivered against the stone and set the idols upon the altar vibrating faintly. Her children stood closest to her. Jonathan, tall and unyielding, his jaw clenched as if he were already imagining himself in her place. Margaret, serene, her eyes half-lidded, swaying slightly as though she were caught between this world and another. And Samuel, pale, reluctant, his diary tucked away in his chamber above, his face betraying the dread he refused to voice aloud. The ritual required more than words. On the altar lay the chalice of ivory, its surface glistening in the candlelight. Eleanor drew a slender blade and cut her palm, letting her blood flow into the vessel. One by one, the circle's members followed, though none gave as much as she did. The chalice grew heavy with crimson, and the air thickened with the metallic tang of sacrifice. Eleanor lifted it, her voice rising, calling upon the unseen forces she had courted for decades. But when she drank, something shifted. Her body convulsed, the chalice slipping from her grasp and spilling its contents across the altar. The members gasped, some rushing forward, others shrinking back in fear. Eleanor staggered, clutching at her chest. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came, only a long, rattling breath. Her skin grew pale in an instant, her veins darkening as though the blood had been sucked from her body. And then she collapsed at the foot of the altar, her eyes staring lifelessly toward the stained glass, her hand still outstretched, as if reaching for something none of the others could see. The chamber erupted. Some whispered that it was a sign, that she had given herself fully to the power she worshipped. Others muttered in terror, insisting it was a punishment, that the price had finally been claimed. But over the voices rose Jonathan's command, his words sharp and cold. He ordered the body to be taken away, the ritual to continue, as though nothing had broken. His authority, once questioned only in shadows, now rang clear. With Eleanor gone, he would take her place. Margaret's voice cut through his, soft but chilling. She declared that Eleanor had not truly died, that her spirit still lingered, speaking to her alone. She claimed the leadership by right of her visions, her serene smile daring anyone to deny her. Jonathan's fury darkened his face, but those who had seen Margaret's trances hesitated, uncertain whether she spoke madness or truth. Samuel said nothing. He stood apart, trembling, staring at his mother's body. To him, it was confirmation of what he had written in his diaries. Their wealth was cursed, their rituals poison, their power bought at the cost of their own souls. Yet even in his silence, his siblings noticed the way he looked at the altar, not with ambition, but with fear. And in a family built on oaths and shadows, fear could be as dangerous as betrayal. By dawn, Eleanor Lancaster's body was sealed in a coffin heavier than wood, its hinges bound with iron. It was lowered not into a family plot, but into the mansion's cellar, beside the sealed vault. Some whispered she had not died at all, that the coffin was meant to hold her until she rose again. Above her resting place, her children gathered, their voices sharpened with accusation, ambition, and distrust. The matriarch was gone, and the mantle of power lay unclaimed. For the first time since the circle's birth, the Lancaster fortune and the cult stood leaderless, and the struggle to claim them both would tear the family apart. The days following Eleanor's death unfolded like a storm tearing through the Lancaster estate. The mansion, once silent in its grandeur, was now filled with the low murmur of plotting voices, footsteps echoing through corridors at all hours, and the restless shifting of servants who sensed that the air itself had grown more dangerous. Jonathan Lancaster moved through it all like a general surveying a battlefield, his dark eyes carrying none of the grief expected of a son, but rather the cold determination of a man seizing his moment. He wasted no time in claiming what he believed was his by right. Within a week of Eleanor's death, he called a gathering in the chapel, summoning not just the family but the circle's most powerful members. Judges, bankers, aldermen, even a bishop whose face was seldom seen outside the cathedral's hallowed halls. Each arrived discreetly, cloaked and cautious. When they entered, they found Jonathan already at the altar, the ivory chalice gleaming in his hand. He did not begin with prayers or lamentations, but with a speech that cut like steel. "The circle of ash does not falter with death," he declared. "It is not bound to one voice, nor does it bow to hesitation. My mother brought us to the threshold. I will lead us through." He spoke not of visions, as Margaret had attempted, nor of doubts, as Samuel quietly harbored. He spoke of power, wealth transmuted into control, influence over the city's gears and levers. He promised protection for those who pledged loyalty, ruin for those who wavered. When he lifted the chalice to his lips, the members rose as one, repeating the oath of silence and loyalty. By the end of that night, his leadership was cemented in ritual, blood, and fear. Under Jonathan, the cult transformed. Where Eleanor had cloaked its workings in mysticism and secrecy, Jonathan dragged it into the machinery of politics and commerce. The Lancaster fortune was no longer just a family hoard of gold and stock certificates, it became a weapon. Senators seeking campaign funds found themselves invited to the mansion's banquet hall, where candlelight flickered against veiled statues and shadows hinted at more than indulgence. Bishops were courted with donations to their dioceses, but behind closed doors they knelt before idols with too many wings. Bankers who controlled the flow of capital found themselves bound by oaths they scarcely understood, their signatures inked in ledgers that recorded more than financial debts. Jonathan's ambition was insatiable. He spread the circle's reach into City Hall, into the courts, into the very bones of New York's power. Newspapers quietly shifted their headlines. Rivals' businesses collapsed overnight under mysterious misfortunes. Those who whispered too loudly about the Lancasters found themselves without positions, without homes, or worse, found floating in the East River. All the while, Jonathan's face appeared in polite society as the image of respectability, a patron of the arts, a benefactor of the poor, a gentleman who had simply inherited his mother's mantle of responsibility. Yet in the chapel, away from the eyes of the city, he grew reckless. His rituals demanded more blood, more binding oaths, more daring invocations of whatever forces lurked behind the stained glass. Some whispered that he no longer prayed to the same spirits Eleanor had courted, that he had opened new doors, darker ones, and that the idols in the vault seemed to hum when he entered. Margaret watched him with her quiet smile, her eyes luminous as though seeing something beyond the room. Samuel, pale and withdrawn, wrote more feverishly in his diary, noting how the city itself seemed to bend under his brother's hand. And the servants whispered late at night that Jonathan had not merely inherited his mother's cult, but reshaped it into something hungrier, sharper, and more dangerous than ever before. In 1899, the Lancaster name no longer merely meant wealth. Under Jonathan, it meant dominion. Senators, bishops, and bankers bent their knees not before marble or gold, but before a family that had become something greater than either and far more terrifying. By the spring of 1900s, Samuel Lancaster was gone from New York. His absence was not announced, nor was it spoken of openly within the mansion, but the servants noticed. His room was stripped of clothing, his bookshelves emptied of journals, and his carriage no longer waited at the side entrance. Only a scattering of letters remained, tucked carelessly in his desk drawer, as though he had wanted them found. In those pages, his handwriting lurched from careful script to erratic scrawls, and the words themselves carried the weight of dread. He wrote not of ordinary fears, scandal, rivals, or Jonathan's wrath, but of something else. Something he described as a presence that clings to the very coins in our vaults, a shadow that breathes through the walls of Fifth Avenue. Samuel had always been the quietest of the Lancaster heirs, a man more suited to study than power. His siblings dismissed him as fragile, perhaps even weak. Yet his letters showed a clarity that unsettled those who read them. He described dreams of black marble halls stretching endlessly, doors that opened to a place of winged shadows, and voices whispering from the sealed vault beneath the chapel. "The wealth is not ours," he wrote in one trembling line. "It was bartered. Every dollar carries the weight of a life already taken, and each day we hoard it, the debt grows heavier." The family dismissed his words as the ramblings of a man unable to shoulder the legacy. Jonathan sneered that Samuel had run away to hide behind superstition. Margaret, with her calm smile, murmured that he was simply too sensitive for the responsibilities they bore. Yet neither could dismiss the unease his letters left behind. For Samuel had not only fled, he had warned. He claimed he was being followed, that a figure stalked him in every city he passed through. A man without a face, a shadow too tall to belong to flesh. In Boston, he saw it standing in the doorway of his hotel room. In Philadelphia, it waited at the edge of the railway platform. By the time his letters reached the family from Baltimore, his words had become frantic, broken, written as though he scrawled them by candlelight with shaking hands. "It wants the bloodline," he wrote. "Not only the fortune, the millions are cursed, but the family is its true harvest." When the letters stopped arriving, no one in the mansion dared ask aloud what had become of him. Jonathan declared that Samuel had abandoned his duty and was no longer to be considered an heir. Margaret, in private, whispered that his silence meant the shadow had claimed him. Servants, overhearing fragments of conversation, spread rumors that Samuel's body had been found in a southern swamp, drained of blood like Eleanor's, though no official record confirmed it. Yet in the mansion's quiet hours, when the storms of the city rattled against the glass, the remaining Lancasters sometimes imagined they could hear Samuel's voice echoing faintly in the chapel, carried along the stone walls with the wind. His warning seemed etched into the house itself, that their millions were not fortune but fetter, that their power was not inherited but borrowed, and that one day the debt would come to claim them all. Jonathan pressed forward, refusing to bend beneath the weight of curses. Margaret listened for whispers in the dark. Certain Samuel had joined the unseen chorus. But those who served the Lancasters, the ones who washed their linens, polished their marble floors, and carried their candles, knew the truth most keenly. For at night, when they counted their wages in the dim glow of oil lamps, they sometimes swore they saw the coins bleed, staining their fingers red. On a bitter January night in 1903, flames tore through the Lancaster mansion. The fire began, according to the official report, in the East Wing, an accident of faulty wiring, though few believed the house of one of New York's most powerful families could be undone by something so mundane. The blaze spread quickly, leaping from room to room, devouring velvet drapes, mahogany staircases, and portraits whose painted eyes seemed to melt and weep as the fire consumed them. By the time the first engines roared down Fifth Avenue, the mansion's great windows glowed like the gates of hell. Crowds gathered despite the cold, their breath clouding the night air as they watched the grand estate collapse into itself. The public saw only wealth undone, a palace of privilege brought low by flame. But the firefighters who braved the inferno discovered something else entirely, something that would never appear in any newspaper column. As the smoke thinned in the early hours of dawn, men with soot-blackened faces emerged shaken, whispering among themselves. They had broken through a section of the cellar that had no doors on the blueprints. Inside was a chamber lined with stone walls, blackened but still intact after the blaze. Within lay heaps of bones, human, animal, difficult to distinguish, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than accident. Relics rested upon shelves, carved directly into the stone. Chalices crusted with old stains, knives etched with foreign inscriptions, and small idols of obsidian and marble, each carved into shapes that made the men recoil. On the floor were chalk and ash diagrams, circles intersecting with strange symbols, preserved enough to show their careful design even as the smoke curled around them. One firefighter, too shaken to continue, swore later to his comrades that he had seen a figure in the chamber, standing between the idols, untouched by the flames. A faceless man, tall and still, watching as though the fire had been nothing more than a curtain lifted on a performance. When he blinked, the figure was gone, but the memory clung to him like smoke. Word of the discovery reached the press within hours. By dawn, reporters crowded the avenue, eager to turn the downfall of the Lancaster estate into headlines that would sell across the city. But they were turned away, not by weary firemen or grieving heirs, but by men in dark coats who carried the authority of money. Bribes were pressed into hands, favors were promised, and threats were whispered. By the next day's edition, the papers reported only a tragic fire, noting with solemnity the destruction of one of Manhattan's great landmarks, not a single mention of bones, not a single mention of the chamber. The mansion itself was gone, reduced to blackened rubble, but the ruins remained under guard for weeks. Jonathan claimed the fire had been an accident, a cruel twist of fate. Margaret spoke little, her eyes gleaming strangely when she passed by the smoldering remains. Some whispered that the fire had not been an accident at all, but a cleansing away to destroy evidence too dangerous to be left behind. Others whispered the opposite, that the fire had been a summoning, and that what was housed beneath the mansion had finally demanded release. For the city, the event became a passing tragedy, swallowed by the constant churn of headlines. But for those who had seen the chamber, or heard whispers of what had been found, the fire on Fifth Avenue was more than ruin. It was revelation. The Lancasters had built their fortune not merely on steel and railroads, but on bones and shadows. And though the house was gone, the family remained, wealth intact, influence unbroken. The fire had not ended the story. It had only burned away the walls that kept its darkest chapters hidden. Time has a way of softening the edges of scandal, of sanding down the sharp points of rumor until only faint whispers remain. By the 1922, New York had changed its skyline, pierced by new towers of steel, its avenues choked with motor cars, its fortunes shifting into the hands of men who made their wealth not on rails but on oil, stock, and speculation. Yet in certain clubs, behind the heavy oak doors of boardrooms, and within the archives of banks whose vaults were deeper than subway tunnels, the name Lancaster was spoken still, never fully fading with the ashes of the mansion on Fifth Avenue. The fortune had survived, almost miraculously, though the house was gone and Samuel's bloodline was rumored to have vanished entirely. Through clever trusts, shell corporations, and discreet mergers, Lancaster wealth spread like roots underground. Railroads became shipping companies, then investment banks. Steel holdings transformed into stakes in burgeoning oil empires. What began as one family's inheritance became a web of power too complex to trace back to its origin, at least for those who did not know where to look. But those who did, the select few invited into shadowed rooms and smoke-filled gatherings, understood that the money was not simply wealth, it was covenant. The circle of ash, though never named in any legal document, lived on through its descendants. The rituals of Eleanor, the ambitions of Jonathan, the warnings of Samuel, all had been distilled into something quieter, subtler, but no less sinister. Masks were no longer worn in midnight chapels. Oaths were instead sealed in boardrooms where contracts were signed in ink that seemed darker than black. Yet behind the polite veneer of modern finance, there remained relics and diagrams, carefully guarded, drawn not for the eyes of auditors, but for the heirs who still carried the bloodline. Whispers clung to the family's legacy. A senator's career that collapsed after he broke ties with a certain firm traced back to Lancaster funds. A banker who leapt from a skyscraper window left behind notes filled with ramblings of the faceless man who followed him in every reflection. Even in Europe, where war loomed and empires crumbled, money appeared in the right pockets at the right time, smoothing over catastrophes, ensuring the Lancaster fortune remained untouched by chaos. To the public, the family was all but invisible, their name diluted into the anonymity of trusts and corporations. Yet their influence was felt everywhere. Theaters they funded debuted plays filled with strange imagery. Universities they endowed quietly built collections of rare manuscripts no student ever saw. Churches they rebuilt seemed to hold a chill at the altar, as if the stained glass did not admit the same light as other sanctuaries. And though decades passed, though the mansion itself was gone, there were those in New York who swore that on certain winter nights, when the fog thickened along Fifth Avenue, one could see it again. Not the ruins, but the house, as it had been towering, lit from within, windows glowing as if a fire burned, not to consume, but to welcome. Some claimed to hear faint chanting carried on the wind, a rhythm like breathless prayer. Others swore they saw a figure in an upper window, tall, faceless, unmoving, watching the city that had grown up around its absence. The Lancaster fortune lived on, not in the gossip columns or public registers, but in the marrow of the city itself. It pulsed through banks, through politics, through foundations and charities that wore the mask of benevolence. And at its heart, hidden among the descendants of the circle of ash, the same vow remained. Wealth was never free, fortune was always fettered, and the debt of blood must always be paid. The ashes of the mansion had long been swept away, but the legacy of ash endured.